And our distinguished speaker today, the Dr. Andrei Znamenski, he received his PhD in history from University of Toledo, Spain. Where is Toledo?
No, there's a city of Toledo in Ohio.
Toledo.
Yeah, it's not Spain.
Not Spain. There's a big city named, I remember. Currently, he's teaching University of Memphis, History Department. His fields of interest include modern Russia, Russia in Northern Asia and Alaska, indigenous people of the Siberia and Alaska, Fourth World, nationalism, and shamanism. Some of his publications are Read the Shambhala, the book name, Magic, Prophecy, and Geopolitics in the Heart of Asia, is the one of his book. Second one, The Beauty of the Primitive, Indigenous Shamanism and Western Imagination. And another one, Power of Myth, Popular Ethno-Nationalism and Nationality Building in Mountain Altai, and the Shamanism and Christianity, Native Encounters with Russian Orthodox Missions in Siberia and Alaska. I'm welcoming Dr. Andrei Znamenski. Welcome.
Thank you. When we were thinking about doing this talk, we tried to choose a date, a certain date, and suddenly, by chance, we decided on February 28th. Little did I know that today is the anniversary of the occupation of Crimea. So my talk, which will deal with three groups of people, Russians, Ukrainians, and Muslim Tatars, who claim this peninsula. Okay. So, Crimean Peninsula, located right here, was taken over by Russian Federation on February 28th. Okay. So my talk today is about why this peninsula is contested. Who are these people who contest this area? So why this area was taken over by Russia, despite all international treaties, in defiance of all international agreements, in defiance of the system of international relationships that was established after 1945. And we'll try to see how much legitimate the claims of particular groups of people to this peninsula. And at the very end, if I have time, I will draw some conclusions. And of course, these conclusions will be based on my own biases. And then you will be welcome to criticize my bias, or you will share with me your biases. Okay. So, Crimean Peninsula. Formally, until February 28 last year, was part of Ukraine. As part of Ukraine, it enjoyed autonomy. It was Crimean Autonomous Republic. February 28. So I just, this morning, again, it dawned on me this date is anniversary, so I put it here, February 28. Polite Green Man. It was nickname for Vladimir Putin's special forces who flew there, who hijacked airports or in big cities, who blocked the major roads there. So they were not rude, but they politely tried to isolate Ukrainian troops, and then they provided a safeguard, quote unquote, for the referendum that decided, referendum of the people of Crimea, that decided that the peninsula should be part of Russia. So how did everything start? So I would like to give you a brief chronology. In February 2014, when the Ukrainian Revolution took place, they ousted the corrupt president, new Ukrainian parliament, People's Parliament took over power, and the first thing they did, see the first bullet point, they decided to make the Ukrainian language the only state language of Ukraine. Before, there were two languages Ukrainian and Russian, they were recognized as state languages because eastern part of Ukraine speaks Russian and the western part of Ukraine speaks Ukrainian. And both groups, most of them speak each other language. So they're bilingual Ukrainians.
How far apart are the two languages?
Like Portuguese and Spanish.
Okay.
I cannot find the best analogy. But more different than Australian English and American English. Okay, so for me, for instance, it's hard to understand Ukrainians. I understand as a Russian like 30-40% of what they speak, but I need to live there to understand more. And look what happened when this law was adopted, and 2 days later, it was by the same parliament. It was waived because it raised the hell. Russians who lived in the eastern part of Ukraine and Russians, especially Russians who live in Crimea, because in Crimea, almost 97% of people, Ukrainians and Muslim Tatars, they speak Russian language. There was a huge outrage and demonstrations started, and that's what the president of Russia, Putin, used to his advantage. He sent these special forces. A referendum was declared, and referendum decided that Crimea should be part of Russia. Well, I would like to mention the two last bullet points. That this provocation, that this mistaken decision made by Ukrainian parliament fed well into the current Russian paranoia. There's nationalism on the rise because Russians still feel insecure. They don't know where they belong. There's a debate: are we Europeans? Are we Asians? They cannot cope with the loss of empire. So a lot of anxieties, a lot of insecurities. A lot of people feel insecure. So this declaration of Ukrainian parliament making Ukrainian language the only language fed well into this ongoing paranoia, okay, the rising tide of Russian nationalism. And of course, those people who in Ukraine who objected occupation of Crimea by Russian special forces, they were labeled by two labels: fascists, Ukrainians, or Muslim extremists. Muslim Tatars, the third major group that live in Crimea. So Russians cheered annexation, mostly. They were overwhelmed, they were happy, they were crying from happiness. Okay, and I will say later at the very end of my talk, how to deal with this happiness. On the other hand, we have Ukrainians being overwhelmed by all events. Ukrainian troops were blocked by Russian troops. They couldn't do anything. Ukrainians were so disorganized, they did not even have any mass demonstrations. So the only group of people that demonstrated against occupation as an organized force were Muslim Tatars. Muslim Tatars. Here you can see a group of Muslim Tatars who carry the Ukrainian flag because they strongly resisted, and to the present day they strongly resist against this occupation. They refused to take Russian passports. They said, we are not Russian citizens, we're Ukrainian citizens. Why is such, again, another paranoia, another anxiety, another fear? What is this fear? What is it all about? Even though President Putin of Russia promised them material perks, he said all your salaries would go up, I would recognize your rights, I would recognize your autonomy. Didn't happen, by the way. Jumping ahead, I wanted to tell you, it didn't happen. But still, it's not about material perks, it's about this. Muslims in Crimea live in the shadow of memories, horrible memory of deportation. In 1944, the entire Muslim minority was kicked out from Crimea. Entire. Not everybody, not a single person was allowed to stay. Stalin in 1944, in 30 minutes, loaded them in cattle trains and shipped them to Uzbekistan, which at that time, the country that was part of the Soviet Union. So they lived in semi-prisoner conditions in special settlements, were supervised by secret police, were not allowed to leave the places where they lived. But at the same time, it wasn't considered a prison. Special settlements, that's how.
What was the reason?
The reason formal reason was that they collaborated with Nazi Germany, and they tried not to antagonize Nazi. Okay. So that's how these relationships work. A lot of Crimean Tatars, by the way, were fighting against Nazis as part of Red Army. And the local community tried to keep this friendly relationship as much as it was possible. They didn't want to antagonize them. So this was blamed on them that they didn't resist actively. So as a punishment, collective punishments, all of them were exiled, including family members of the Red Army soldiers. That was a horrible thing. So they live to the present day in the shadow of this, what happened with them in 1944, and I will tell you why it happened and how it happened. Okay. So now, what do we have now, right now, in this particular area? We have Russians who are a majority here, see almost 60%. We have Ukrainians who are 24%, and we have Crimean Tatars, 12%. Crimean Tatars were not allowed to go back to Crimea until 1967. Even after Stalin died, they were not allowed. It was a long-time human rights movement. A lot of Tatar leaders were fighting for the right to go back to their homeland. Only in 1967, some of them, a few hundreds of them, were allowed to come back, but not everybody. It was only in 1991, when Soviet Union was gone, the entire group of people was allowed to go back. Okay. So 70% of them came back. The total number of Muslim Tatars right now in Crimea, it's 250,000 people. Okay. The total population of Crimea is, I don't have exact numbers, 2 million, 2.5 million, something like this, 2.6 million. So they are minorities. Okay. After, and even before, and especially after Crimea was occupied by Russia last year, the debates are still going on. Each group claims Crimea. Russians claim, and they have legitimate quote-unquote claims, and they find historical proof. Ukrainians do the same thing, and Tatars do the same thing. Let's take a look at this. What is going on? Who owns Crimea? Russians claim we own Crimea. First, of course, we're a majority here, first of all. But people say, wait a second. Yes, right now you're a majority, but historically you were not majority. You came here recently. Yes, you're right, but look what happened. Crimea was the cradle of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Indeed. One of the primary Russian chronicles, it's a primary chronicle, it's the most ancient surviving document about ancient Russia, Middle Ages, was kept by monks, said that Prince Vladimir, one of the first Russian princes in early Middle Ages, was baptized in Crimea in 1988. But it's questionable because there's another primary chronicle that said no, he wasn't baptized in Crimea, he was baptized in Kiev. Okay. Plus, as I'm a historian, that's my job, I have to share with you something. Prince Vladimir wasn't pure Russian, so to speak. He was a Viking, because Vikings, a Viking elite, they came to Russia, they took over this area that became known as Kievan Russia. Okay. Later they merged with local Slavic people, but for a long time the elite was Scandinavian. So if you want to find pure root, so he could not be even considered full-fledged Russian, this Prince Vladimir. And ancient Christian ruins here, correct, absolutely correct, but whose ruins are they? Greek and Byzantine ruins. They're not Russian ruins. Yes, they're Christian ruins, but they're not Russian ruins. Another argument, blood and soil, the most recent argument. Thousands of Russians died defending this land. When? Russian-Turkish wars. Long wars. More than 200 years, Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire were fighting. And I will make an emphasis. One of the next slides will emphasize that the modern fate of Crimea, it was a contested land between Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire. Back and forth, back and forth. So we lost a lot of people, Russian soldiers. So the blood, Russian blood, was spilled here, so it's a sacred land for us. Crimean War. So France and England against Russia. Ottoman Empire supported France and England at that time. Another historical landmark that is very important. Russia experienced a humiliating defeat in 1850s at the hands of Ottoman Empire, England, and France. But thousands of soldiers died there. Again, another event that our soldiers died there. And finally, the Second World War. When Crimea was being liberated from Germans, a lot of our soldiers died. That's what Russians say. But who are these soldiers? Soviet army was multinational. For goodness sake, there were Crimean Tatars there too. There were Ukrainians in the Soviet army. Everybody was recruited. So you cannot totally claim that Russian people died. It was a multinational force during Soviet times. So, but to some extent it's correct. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Okay? To some extent, yes, a lot of Russians, especially 19th century, died. Let's move on. Who owns Crimea? Ukrainians say, we own Crimea. How come? Historically, it's our sacred land because Crimea is the cradle of Orthodox Christianity. Our Prince Volodymyr, Russians call him Vladimir. Ukrainians say our Prince Volodymyr was converted to Orthodox Christianity there in 1988. See, that's the irony of the situation, because in early Middle Ages, there were no Russians and Ukrainians, they were the same people. So late Middle Age, they became separated. That's how Ukrainians and Russians became Russians and Ukrainians. Before there was no division. Okay. Ancient Christian ruins here. Yes, correct, but whose ruins are they? They are not Ukrainian and Russian ruins. They are Greek and Byzantine Christian ruins. Okay. Legally, it's a Ukrainian land. Correct? Correct. Yes. This is absolutely correct. Why? Because in 1954, Khrushchev, Soviet communist leader, just on a whim gave this land to Ukraine because it was handy. You know, the Sun Peninsula was a part of Russian Socialist Republic. It doesn't make sense because Soviet Union were the same. Who cares? It's administratively, since Ukraine borders with Crimea, let's just put it there. You know, he didn't think twice about it. So he did it in 1954. And finally, in 1991, when Soviet Union was gone, a decision was made that Crimea would be part of Ukraine, as it had been done in 1954. An agreement was made to respect administrative borders that had existed in the Soviet Union, and these administrative borders should be borders of new states. Okay, so everybody agreed. Plus, in case of Ukraine, not only 1991 mutual agreement was in power, but another, the third agreement, which I didn't mention here, so my fault. There should be another number. 1993. What was this agreement? Ukraine promised to give up her nuclear weapons. Everything was moved to Russia. In exchange, UK, United States, and Russia collectively promised that the borders of Ukraine would be respected forever and ever. So the three decisions. So legally, yes, indeed, it's Ukrainian land. Who owns Crimea? Again, Muslim Tatars say, we own this. You guys have no rights. Okay. Crimean Tatars claim it's our native land, sacred land. We had our state here before Russians, Ukrainians took over Crimea. Correct? Correct. Yes, absolutely correct. And I'm going to tell you about this, how it happened. Our Muslim sacred sites here. Correct? Correct. Absolutely correct. Okay. So three groups, and constantly contest each other. But Muslim Tatars who are put right now in a situation of choice, they prefer Ukrainians because, again, Russia in their eyes is associated with the Soviet Union. Why? Because Russians use Soviet symbols, and a lot of Russians still love Soviet legacy. They have nostalgia for Soviet Union, for Stalin. So Muslim Tatars, they have this fear, hidden fear that we don't want to be under Russians, we would prefer Ukrainians. Okay. Crimea in modern times. See, I told you, and I'm repeating myself. Crimea was contested by Ottoman and Russian empires. So what is this land? What was this land in modern times? Land with a mixed Muslim Christian population before the Crimean War. Crimean War was the huge landmark in the middle of the 19th century. Before the Crimean War, Muslims were the majority there. after they were becoming the minority, okay, because they were squeezed out. They were squeezed gradually. In fact, what Stalin did with the Crimean Tatars, it wasn't so, of course, he did it in a modern way, in a brutal way, on an industrial kind of, with this magnitude, industrial magnitude. But the irony of the situation is that Russian Tsars did the same thing. They had done the same thing. So the Russian Tsars established this pattern, kind of squeezing out Muslims from this era. I'm a historian. As a historian, I'm going to take you briefly to give you this picture, how this mixed population, this multi-ethnic population came about historically. So I'm taking you to the most ancient times, and to the most ancient times. Greeks, who were pagans, by the way, established their settlements here during this time. 400s, 1000s BC, this area was colonized by Greeks. And one of the most ancient Greek colonies is Chersonesus. Chersonesus, it's present-day Sebastopol, okay, which Russians consider our sacred town. So Greeks had established it. And in fact, they established their settlements all over Black Sea and Turkey, present-day Turkey. There were some settlements in Italy, in Northern Africa. Okay. A lot of ruins. If you go to Crimea, so present Russian government advertises, tourists, please come, because tourist industry is almost gone, non-existent. People are afraid to go there. So Russian government said, go and look at all these ruins. Yes, indeed, a lot of Greek ruins, if you go there. So Chersonesus, that's how it looks right now. Early Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages, you know, if you read something about history, that Greeks later were squashed by Romans. There was a Roman Empire. At some point in history, Roman Empire became split because too big to control. Okay? The western part was overwhelmed by so-called Germanic barbarians. But what about eastern part? Eastern part survived for 700 years and became known as Byzantine Empire. And these Byzantine pagan people, Greek people, were converted to Christianity, accepted Christianity when in 313 Christianity became legalized. And that's how southern part of Crimea, we're not talking about northern part, southern part of Crimea, where Greek settlements had been located, became Christian, Greek Christianity, Eastern Christianity, okay? But interesting thing, look at this. Something is here, so let me decipher, okay? The northern part of Crimea was controlled by a nomadic state called Khazaria that had accepted Judaism. So that is why, just for convenience, I put here the star, Jewish star, here this cross, although it's not correct. It should be Eastern Orthodox cross. It's not a good map.
We weren't different yet.
And here a Muslim, because Middle East. Okay. So here we have in the southern part of Crimea, we have Greek Orthodox Christians. The northern part we have Judaists and some pagans, because Khazaria was a tolerant state, elite was preaching Judaism, but common people were allowed to worship whatever gods they wanted to worship. And then Mongols come, Genghis Khan and his successors, 1200s, early Middle Ages. They come and create this huge empire, take over. And Mongols were pagans, shamanists. Okay, but Mongols were very tolerant. They were assimilated by the people they occupied. There were few in China. They were assimilated by the Chinese. In the Middle East, in present-day Iraq, when they came, they became assimilated by local Arabic people. In the present-day Turkey, they were also assimilated by local people. And in fact, Mongols later adopted Islam. Okay. In Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, all of them converted to Islam. So those Mongols who occupied this area before it was part of this huge Mongol empire, they became Muslim. Okay, Muslim. But later, this huge Mongol empire disintegrated, and the eastern part of the Mongol empire was so-called Golden Horde, which also controlled Russia, because Russia was dominated by Golden Horde. And this area was dominated by Golden Horde. Then Golden Horde fell apart. Okay? And what we have out of Golden Horde, we have a bunch of small kingdoms splitting away. And one of these runaway kingdoms was called Crimean Khanate. Okay. Briefly, only briefly, I repeat, only briefly, in the 1400s, it enjoyed independence. Because at that time, you couldn't enjoy independence. There were big empires, so sooner or later, you had to be dominated by somebody. But for a while, this Crimean Peninsula was independent. So eventually, if I just showed you another previous slide, says to us that in 1475, it was taken over by Ottoman Empire. Since that on, it was controlled by Ottoman Empire. But by religion, this northern part of Crimean Peninsula was already connected to Ottoman Empire. But at the same time, you see something here. You see here this brown spot, green spot. What about this? The green part, it's still Greek Orthodox Christians. Because Crimean Khanate, or kingdom, was very tolerant. They didn't force these people to convert to Islam. They recognized this Greek Orthodox kingdom. It was called the Principality of Theodore. One of the kings of the Greeks was named Theodore to consolidate this kingdom. And they allowed them to worship the god. They paid tribute to Crimean kingdom, but religiously they were free. The southernmost part of Crimean Peninsula, it was so-called Genoan states. Genoa, it's a city in Italy. Okay. A bunch of Italians came here in the 1300s and established trade colonies here. Okay. You probably know the Venetia, Genoa, in the Middle Ages traded widely in the Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea. So these Italians created here Genoese colonies here. They were independent. Each town was independent. And they were Latin Christians or Roman Catholic. At that time, they didn't use this expression. They were nicknamed, labeled Latin Christians because they use Latin language. So we have this Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox. We have Roman Catholics and Muslims here. Okay. And then this area was taken over by the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So formally it became the part of Ottoman Empire, and Crimean khans or kings were considered vassals. Formally they were independent in domestic life, but the foreign policy was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And that's how it was until 1783, when Russia took over the entire peninsula. So let's take a look at the Tatars of Crimea. Who were these people? Tatars were present-day Tatars, descendants of all these three groups of people. Okay, so remember this peninsula I showed you, layered in 3 layers. Out of these 3 layers, we have present-day Tatars. Okay, that is why I put the word natives in the quotation marks. Okay, it's not like homogeneous group of them. Okay, and you will see. I will show you the pictures, the facial pictures of Crimean Tatars, the different types of. Different anthropological types. Okay. But still, well into modern times, since Muslims were the majority, local people, for practical reasons, these Greeks and Italians started to convert to Islam. Okay. So eventually, by 1600s, almost the entire peninsula was Muslim. Even though we have Greeks, we have Italians, almost all of them converted to Islam. Those who didn't want to convert left. Okay. So it's a product, present-day Tatars, Muslim Tatars, the product of mixture of Mongols, descendants of these Genghis Khan people, Greeks, Italians, local Turkic-speaking nomads, who had been Judaists, some of them in ancient times, Khazars, and Ottoman Turks, because Ottoman Turks started coming here. Okay, soldiers and agents of the Sultans, so a lot of them. So it was until the end of the 19th century the largest group, Tatars, or the largest group of the population. Okay. And in culture, in language, they were close to Ottoman Turks, okay, because of this long time presence within the Ottoman Empire. But historically, as I told you, they were the mixture of all these three cultures. Now look at this, if you can see this anthropological types. Look, for instance, this young boy. He looks like a Mongolian a little bit, a Mongolian type. Look at this lady. She looks like a European. Okay. Look at some of these. They look like Turks. Okay. But all of them Tatars. So I just purposely picked up different anthropological types to show to you that's like people of the middle ground. That's how the best way to define them. Okay. Even though by language, I repeat, by language, Tatar language, which incorporated, by the way, some Greek language, some Mongol words, it's still a Turkic speaking language, which is close to Ottoman Turks, and the religion of the Tatars is Islam. Okay. Let's move on. So Crimea was conquered by the Russian Empire. When? There were long wars between Turkey and Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, under command of this man, Burkhard Christoph von Munich, invaded Crimea, burning, destroying everything on their way. Why? Simply because it was revenge. Why such revenge? Destroying mosques, everything. Killing Muslim Tatars. Slash and burn text. Because one of the major specialties of the Crimean kingdom, before it was part of Ottoman Empire, and when it became part of Ottoman Empire, was slave trading. That was the major business. Crimean khans or kings organized armies that invaded what today we call Ukraine, southern Russian borders, abducting people and selling them. So that was the major business. And the local khan, Crimean khan, received 20% payment for each slave procured by his people. Okay. So a lot of people were seized and from southern Russia, and in the revenge campaign was organized. Again, you might be surprised the German were a lot of commanders, part of the Russian elite were Germans. And Catherine the Great completed the job of destroying Crimean kingdom, subjugating it to Russia, 1783. So that's the year when Russia took over Crimean Peninsula. So this lady, nicely looking lady, Catherine the Great, completed the job because she was an empire builder. She thought about herself as this. She was not Russian, she was German, like many other Russian czars. And you know that when you're a new kid on the block or don't belong to this, the majority, you try to prove I'm one of yours. That is why in Russia they have these czars, they try to prove that they're more Russian than Russians. It's the same thing. I always tell my students, we have to research this. Why Napoleon, who wasn't a Frenchman, you know, this, tried to be more French than French people. Yeah, well, Stalin tried to be more Russian than Russians. So it's an interesting phenomenon. But digression. Okay, Crimea becomes part of Russian Empire, 1783, and remains so until 1917. Okay. And of course, Catherine the Great, who, when a young girl, she was not part of Greek Orthodox Church. She wasn't part of Russian Christianity. She was a Lutheran. When young, when she came to Russia, she converted to Russian Christianity, and she wanted to make sure that Russian Christianity would be spread all over. So that's what she decided to do. Her policies was to squeeze out Islam from Crimea, so make it more Christian. Many monuments constructed under Crimean Khan were destroyed or left in ruins. And that is why in Crimea, many of these ruins are not recognizable right now. Okay? Because under Russian Christians, some of Muslim mosques were raised and churches were built at their place. You know. Demolished. And I will show you, I just found last week, I updated this presentation. One of the English travelers in the 19th century traveled to Crimea and published this interesting picture. How an old Ottoman mosque was rebuilt into church, and here you see this kind of mixture, half Christian, half Muslim. Interesting mixture. And that they did it, some mosques were left, 11 or 12 mosques were left, but majority of mosques were razed, either destroyed or rebuilt into the churches, because the policy was to squeeze out Muslims. It's an interesting thing. Catherine the Great, I have to be fair, she was a very tolerant woman, and in fact she didn't impose any Christianity on those Tatars who lived in other parts of the Russian Empire, within the empire. But here she made the point that we need to erase Islam and make sure that Christianity is here. Why? Because Ottoman Empire was next door. We have to kick out all Muslims and make sure that our borderlands populated by Christians. Okay. And jumping ahead, I want to mention that's precisely what Stalin wanted to do. He didn't like when these unreliable minorities live in borderlands. You know, he wanted to have them somewhere in the mainland to kind of squeeze them out. Borderlands should be populated by reliable people. Ironically, even Greek ruins were exploited by Russian policies to impose Christianity in Crimea. So here you see it's same place, Chersonesus, the Greek settlement that had been founded in ancient times. In early 19th century, Russian cathedral, Russian Orthodox cathedral was built there next door to ancient Greek ruins to show that we are linked to this past. It's ours. We are going to colonize this past. It belongs to us. Squeezing out the Tatars in the 1800s. Okay. The first deportation happened actually under Catherine. The wealthy Tatars elite who controlled, had money. They were kicked out from Crimea. But the poor people, common people, were said, remain, you're ours. It was a purposeful policy to squeeze out the elite because the elite had money. They could start something, so there was a fear. So they were expelled to Ottoman Empire. The next event, Napoleon invaded Russia 1812, and what they did, the same thing. What Stalin did later, 1944. Fear of Tatars that they were unreliable, and they were squeezed out. Half of them were squeezed out from Peninsula, or forced literally to go to Ottoman Empire. And that's how, by the way, in present-day Turkey, we have 200,000 Tatars living in present-day Turkey. It's descendants of these people who had been kicked out in the 1700s and the 1800s. Then Crimean War comes, when the Russians lost this war. There was a fear, indignation, and of course, somebody had to become a scapegoat. Who was the scapegoat? So England, France, and Ottoman Empire defeated Russia. Who could be a scapegoat? Tatars, who lived there, Muslims. So that was another biggest deportation. So 12,000 Tatars, intimidated by local Russians, who were forced, literally forced to board the Turkish boats and escape because life was unsafe for them. Okay. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, we have 200,000 out of 300,000 Tatars moving to Turkey. Okay. So again, whatever Stalin did had historical precedence. And finally, deportation comes, 1944. As I said, I was asked about what was the excuse. The excuse, formal excuse, was collaboration with the Nazi, and they were loaded in cattle trains and resettled to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan. Struggled to return. Only in 1991 they were allowed to return. By the way, before they were allowed to return, look at the census data. 1959, Russians 71%, Ukrainians 11%, and Tatars 0%. Okay. Soviet time. Crimea was part of Soviet Ukrainian Republic. See, right here. Okay. 1954. Then Soviet Union collapses, disintegrates. We have Autonomous Republic of Crimea with a wide autonomy, okay, on the Ukrainian government. That is why they felt happy. But at the same time, look at this map. I'm going back to what I started with, remember? Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking. The areas of Ukraine colored in dark red. That's where Russian speakers only live. The majority of Russian speakers. Some of them understand Ukrainian. Sometimes they understand, but they don't speak. So Crimea is the place with the highest concentration of Russian-speaking people. And I repeat, these are both Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. All of them speak Russian language. And here, the same thing. That's where we have fights right now. Okay. This area is both languages spoken. Okay. And this area is Ukrainian speaking. But literally, as I said before in the beginning, everybody knows each other's language. Occupation of Crimea happened not on February 28th last year. It was going on in the 1990s. That's amazing. Okay. The more I tried to read about, the more I realized that the soil was prepared for what happened on February 28th last year. Okay. And here I want to give you some ideas. Plus, culturally, the place was definitely, linguistically, the place was definitely Russian speaking. In terms of culture, huge efforts were made by the Russian government, formally and informally, to convince themselves and people who live in Crimea that's a part of Russia. Okay, so let me mention a few things. First, in 1990s, one of the most popular, it also related to the tourist business, so-called holy archaeology, when the Russian Orthodox Church invested a lot of money, thousands of dollars sponsoring holy archaeology. To do what? To reconstruct Greek Orthodox monuments, but to reinterpret them, to make sure that they are reinterpreted not in terms of Byzantine or Greek culture, but in terms of Russian culture. To tell people that these monuments, these ancient relics are part of Russia. Okay, so it's a different thing, for tourists especially. So archaeologists were hired and sent to Crimea from Russia to do excavation, publications, and helping tourist bureaus to reinterpret these relics as part of Russia. Okay. So this is, ancient ruins are very important for nationalists, because a good nationalist, what does he do? A good nationalist, or a good nationalist government. They try to tell everybody, we're the most ancient. We're the most ancient. And they try to find historical examples to prove that, oh, we're so ancient, we have right to this land. Each nationalist does this. So that's what the Russian Orthodox Church was doing. There were literally some grounds in the area of Sebastopol, Maria Daria area, where a Muslim mosque, premises of Muslim mosque and premises of a Russian monastery started to contest each other. So Russian monastery said, no, this land belongs to us. Tatars who were going to this mosque, Maria Daria, said, no, this land belongs to us. So on the Ukrainian government, they still didn't resolve this issue. So now, of course, the issue has been resolved in favor of the Russian monastery. Okay? In 1997, a big deal was made out of this. What happened? In Chersonesus, ancient Greek ruins, suddenly the Russian Orthodox Church hired a helicopter and brought gazebo with the Russian Orthodox cross here and put right in the middle of the Greek ruins. This is ours. It's one of the best examples how people literally try to stake it. I put my stick here and I claim this area. Okay? This is ours. This is our Orthodox Christian side, Russian Orthodox. But of course, is it Russian Orthodox? No, because the area was founded by Greek pagans. Greek pagans who later were converted to Greek Orthodox. So you cannot claim that these ruins are Orthodox. These ruins have been left by people who. Okay. And finally, annexation happens. Okay. Annexation happens. Those people who welcomed Russian presence, they participated in the so-called referendum. I put it in quotation marks. Why? Referendum is a good thing. It's a good thing. And I think people, each ethnic group, should have a right to secede, should have a right to self-determination. But how it was done? The referendum was done under protection, quote unquote, the Russian troops. So the legitimacy of this referendum is nil. It doesn't make sense. If it had been done without Russian troops, of course, no questions would have been asked. And I'm sure they would have won, Russians anyway, because they were majority. And the choices were given. See, that's the choice. The opponents of secession were pictured as fascists, as I said, Muslim extremists. Okay? The supporters of referendum were pictured as true Russian patriots. Okay? Immediately when the area after referendum was occupied, the Russian administration was established. The environment, intolerable environment was created for Muslim Tatars because it was the only organized group that resisted Russian invasion. Okay, so if you Google Crimean Peninsula Tatars, you will see these images, Google images. Some thugs put these inscriptions that says Tatars out of Crimea. There's swastika just to intimidate people. Some houses of Tatar leaders are marked with crosses to send them a message that get out. Their self-governing Medjalis, its local self-government, was shut down recently. Their radio station, TV station, was forced to cover on the culture, forbidden to cover politics, economic life. Mutual aid societies of Tatars were shut down. And now my time is almost up, so I don't want you to fall asleep here. So I'm going to make two arguments, and then we might debate if you have time, if you're not sleepy. So argument number one, poison called history. Okay. So we know that if historical claims are issued by certain groups to native lands, quote unquote, they're bogus normally. Okay. Not a single group on earth can literally claim this is ours, because there was so much mixture in history that normally if you look deeply into these claims, they don't make sense. Okay? Crimean history shows that this land cannot be totally claimed by each group. Although Tatars, of course, had the state, they were before, but still, even in their cases, they were the product of this mixture of these people. Okay? So that's the first argument. So beware of the historical claims. You know some parts of the world where we created a lot of trouble and there is no way to resolve this conflict. Okay, so now we have another conflict in addition to other conflicts which you know about. I don't know what to mention them. Argument number two, secession is a very good thing. Secession. And I think Russians in Crimea should have right to secede. It's their right. But it should be done in the right way, without presence of the troops. Because they shot themselves in the foot when they had the Russian troops and go into referendum. They should have asked Putin to move out the troops and then to do the referendum. Okay? Of course, Russians have right to secede. But so do the Tatars have a right to secede from Russians right now. But unfortunately, they don't have right to do it. See, double standard. At the same time, Russia, for instance, insisting that Crimea have a right to secede, self-determination, practices double standards as far as the other areas of Russia that wanted to secede, like Chechnya is the first example. Chechnya was squashed, and the Russian administration was imposed on Chechnya. It does make sense. From Ukraine, the Russian government demanded to give Crimea a right to secede, but inside the Russian Federation, they didn't allow Chechen people to secede. So typical double standard. Okay? So do Russians in eastern Ukraine have a right to secede. And it was the biggest mistake of Ukrainian government, trying to hold them within the country. If they don't want, they have a right to secede. You might not like these people. You might think it's part of your land, but if a majority of people want to secede, in order to make a peace, to have peaceful relationships. So you have to overcome your nationalist ego, which is big. Ukrainians have big nationalist ego. You have to overcome your ego and allow these people to secede. We just talked about it when we were eating. The good, higher the border, the more friendship you have. So in this case, they couldn't resolve the issue easily, Ukrainians. Okay, you totally cannot blame Russia, of course, has to be blamed, because right now Russia instigates this conflict, send the troops and Russian army, in disguise as present there in the eastern area. But you cannot totally exonerate Ukrainian government, which was feeding this conflict by insisting that you should be part of us. But so do Ukrainians in Crimea have a right to secede if they want, if they have areas, local areas that don't want to be part of Russia, they also have a right to secede. So that's my argument. And on this note, let me finish, and maybe some questions, concerns. Thank you.
If you have any questions.
This is rather interesting. Thank you for a very enlightening historical perspective, especially. I'm wondering, the language demarcation is interesting in Ukraine, but beyond that, I wonder if there is an undercurrent that the current conflict, East and West Ukraine, due to religious differences, such as Orthodox versus Catholic.
No, absolutely no.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
Both parts of Ukraine are Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
The only exception in the westernmost part of Ukraine, that was before First World War, called Galicia, part of Austria-Hungary. There is a Greek Orthodox. They're called Uniates. So it means they're Greek Orthodox in terms of rituals. Everything is like in a Greek Orthodox Church, but administratively they're subjected to the control of the Roman Pope. That is why it's called Uniate Church. Okay. But in terms of rituals, it's a minority. It's a small minority.
But there's no demarcation, major demarcation by Catholic versus Russian Orthodox.
No.
Yeah, okay.
It's not what you think. No, it's both parts of Ukraine, so-called Ukrainian speaking and Russian speaking. They are Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
Okay.
There is, however, a Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Yes, that's how they call themselves. Yeah.
It had. I don't know how much independence
it
has from the Russian Orthodox.
See, we are talking about in Ukraine. There are two Orthodox churches: Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Russian Orthodox Church. Same architecture, same rituals. The only difference in administration. It's the same thing. Like I just said, Uniate Church in the westernmost part of Ukraine listens to what Roman Pope has to say. But in terms of rituals, architecture, everything is like in Greek Orthodox Church. It's the same thing.
I may be getting a little technical here, but during Soviet times there was a part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that remained underground and fell out of communion with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that got along with the communist administration.
Yeah, it's those.
They have a big convent in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, for example. And I wondered if those have gotten back together now.
No, they're coming together. Again, it's about administration. It's about differences in administration. But in terms of rituals, no difference. Yeah. Because on the Soviet times, Greek Orthodox Church in Soviet Union was subjected to control of the secret police. Okay? Those people who didn't want to be controlled. So they seceded. And there was Greek Orthodox Church in the United States, in North America. There was Ukrainian Orthodox Church in North America, the other areas. Yeah. So we're talking about different administration. We're not talking about differences, doctrinal differences.
So what is your best estimate of the future of Crimea?
Future of Crimea will be the same as the future of Gaza, Cyprus. It will be frozen conflict forever. So, students ask me, is there any way to resolve Middle Eastern conflict, Israel and Palestinians? The answer, no. There is no way to resolve this conflict. It will be with us forever. Unless two sides decide to pay attention to individual freedoms instead of nationalism, statism, and something. The superficial things. Maybe at the end of the 21st century, when people will be less and less thinking in tribal terms, in terms of big collectives, and more thinking in terms of individuals, they will be naturally resolving these issues. But
maybe a miracle.
Right?
You know, Middle East is a miracle happening place, so maybe a miracle will happen.
Miracles happen, but not in our lifetime.
You're too pessimistic.
Well, so far, you have to be pessimistic. You have to be pessimistic because as long as we have nations and nationalism, we have national borders, right? So what can you do about this? Like, yeah, we could have the same talk about Palestinians and Israelis right now. Same thing. The only reason we talk about Crimea because we added something new to existing conflicts.
I would like to thank Dr. Znamenski for this informative speech, and also I would like to thank our volunteer ladies who made the dinner homework.
If you want to discuss something more, here is my card. Okay.
Also, I would like to give you the one Turkish water marbling handmade.
Oh, oh, thank you.
Yeah, that is great.
Maybe Dr. Bobo can explain what this is water marbling. They made this picture on the water. And paper. I'll show the video about it.
Yeah, because you should explain to me how they do it. So,
Yes.
sounds Greek to me. Good, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. That's great. My goodness, I didn't expect it.
Let me explain. Thank you for coming. I hope to see you in our future events.